In the unforgiving heart of the 1870s, Arizona Territory, a single act of mercy could be a death sentence. For Clara Hayes, a woman left with nothing but 40 acres of dust and a ghost-pale mare, desperation was a constant companion. When she found 2 Apache boys bleeding and near death at her dry creek bed, she faced an impossible choice: leave them to the buzzards as her neighbors would, or risk everything on a fool's hope of humanity. She chose hope. She gave them her last horse. Little did she know that single act of kindness would bring 200 warriors to her doorstep at dawn. This is the story of what happened next. The sun over the Chiricahua Mountains was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer beating down on the cracked earth of Clara Hayes's small ranch, turning the air to a shimmering haze. By October of 1875, everything felt brittle. The grass was bleached to the color of old bone. The creek bed, a muddy trickle in spring, was now a scar of sun-baked stones. Even the memories of her family, once vibrant, felt like pressed flowers, fragile and faded. Clara, at 23, was the sole heir to this kingdom of dust. Cholera had taken her mother and father within a week of each other the previous winter, leaving her with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Her younger brother Samuel had gone east to find a doctor and never returned. Neighbors were sparse and suspicious, hunkered down on their own patches of unforgiving land. The nearest town, a dusty collection of saloons and supply stores, a hard day's ride away, offered little comfort. To them she was the Hayes girl, the one who was either too stubborn or too foolish to sell out and go back east where a woman belonged. She was down to her last treasure dust devil. The mare was a pale buckskin, almost white in the harsh sun, with a spirit as resilient as the wiry grama grass that clung to life around them. She was the last of her father's proud stock, a 4-legged promise that not everything was lost. Dust Devil was her means of escape, her partner in solitude, her only link to a life that had been full of laughter and the scent of her father's pipe tobacco. Every morning Clara would lean her forehead against the mare's warm neck, breathing in the scent of horse and hay, and find the strength to face another day. Her days were a litany of hard labor, mending fences that the wind tried to tear down, hauling water from the well which grew deeper and more reluctant each week, tending her small garden of hardy squash and beans, praying for a rain that never came. Loneliness was a constant ache, a phantom limb where her family used to be. On this particular afternoon, the heat was a physical presence pressing in from all sides. Clara was returning from the far pasture, checking for breaks in the wire fence her father had so painstakingly strung. She carried a Winchester 73, its weight familiar and comforting in her hands. In this land, a firearm was as essential as a water canteen. She walked with a long, steady stride, her worn leather boots kicking up puffs of red dust. It was the unnatural stillness that first alerted her. The usual chatter of sparrows in the mesquite bushes was absent. Even the insects seemed to have fallen silent. A prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. She slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape, searching for anything out of place. That's when she saw them. Down in the dry creek bed, nestled among the smooth, sun-bleached rocks, were 2 figures. From a distance, they were just bundles of dark cloth and darker skin. Her first thought was Comancheros, or bandits lying in ambush. She dropped to one knee behind a thicket of creosote, her heart hammering against her ribs. She raised the Winchester, the cool metal of the stock, a familiar comfort against her cheek. She sighted down the long barrel, her breath held tight in her chest. But as she watched, she realized they weren't waiting in ambush. They weren't moving at all. One was curled on his side, The other lay flat on his back, an arm flung out at an awkward angle. They were small, too small to be men. Boys. Caution warred with a deeper, more ingrained instinct, one her mother had nurtured in her. You don't leave a soul to suffer if you can help it. Cursing her own foolishness, she rose slowly and began to make her way down the embankment the Winchester held at the ready. As she drew closer, the scene resolved into a grim tableau. They were Apache boys. Their black hair was matted with dirt and something dark and sticky. The older one, perhaps 14, had a crude, bloody bandage tied around his thigh. A dark stain was spreading from it, soaking into the dusty ground. The younger boy, no older than 10, had a gash on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. They wore simple buckskin leggings and cotton shirts, both torn and stained with blood. A broken arrow shaft lay near the older boy's hand. Clara's mind raced. Apaches. The word itself was a curse on the lips of every settler in the territory. They were ghosts of the mountains whispered about in tales of raids and bloodshed. The Apache wars, led by men like Cochise, had only recently subsided into a fragile, simmering peace. But tension remained thick and volatile, like dry lightning in the summer sky. To be found with 2 of them, even children, could mean being branded a traitor. It could get her killed. The older boy stirred his eyes, fluttering open. They were dark, filled with a mixture of pain and fierce, defiant pride. He saw her, a white woman with a rifle, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. But the effort was too much. A wave of pain washed over his face, and he slumped back against the rocks, his breath hissing through his teeth. Clara stood frozen, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, walk away, and forget what she had seen. This was not her fight. They were the enemy. But then her gaze fell on the younger boy. His face, underneath the grime and blood, was soft, with the innocence of childhood. He looked no different from her own brother Samuel when he had been that age. He made a small whimpering sound in his sleep, a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. A boy's fear, her father had once told her, was the same in any language. In that moment, the years of ingrained fear and prejudice crumbled, leaving behind a simple, stark reality. These were not warriors. They were not ghosts. They were children, bleeding and dying in the dirt, and she was the only one there to see it. She lowered the Winchester. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to the person her parents had raised her to be. She took a deep breath, the hot, dry air scorching her lungs, and took a step forward. Clara set the rifle down, a deliberate act of trust she wasn't sure she felt. The older boy watched her every move, his dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. His hand remained on the hilt of his knife, his knuckles white. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. It felt rusty from disuse. He likely didn't understand her words, but he would understand her actions. Slowly she unslung the canteen from her shoulder and knelt beside the younger boy. She unscrewed the cap and gently dribbled a small amount of water onto his cracked lips. He moaned softly, and his tongue darted out to catch the precious drops. The older boy's gaze flickered from his brother to Clara, a flicker of something other than hate in their depths. It might have been confusion, or perhaps a sliver of hope. Clara's mother had been a healer of a sort. She had a deep knowledge of herbs and remedies skills learned from her own mother back in Ohio. She had taught Clara how to clean a wound, how to set a bone, how to read the signs of a fever. "The Lord gives us 2 hands to help Clara," she used to say, her fingers busy grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "It's a sin not to use them." Clara moved to the older boy. "Let me see," she said, gesturing to his leg. He flinched as she reached for the crude bandage, his body tensing. "No." He rasped the word, a harsh grunt. It was one of the few English words many natives knew. "It's festering." She insisted, her tone firm but gentle. "It will kill you." She looked him directly in the eye, trying to convey an honesty that would cross the barrier of language and fear. For a long moment, they were locked in a silent battle of wills. He was a boy trying to be a man, a warrior protecting his younger brother. She was a woman trying to save them both, armed with nothing but a canteen and a memory of her mother's hands. Finally, with a grimace of pain and reluctance, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Working quickly, Clara soaked a strip of cloth from her satchel with water and began to gently peel away the blood-caked fabric from his thigh. The wound beneath was ugly. It was a deep puncture, likely from a lance or a piece of shrapnel, swollen and an angry red at the edges. Infection had already set in. The younger boy's head wound was less severe, but he was weak from blood loss and dehydration. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't treat them here, exposed to the elements, and whatever had attacked them in the first place. She needed to get them back to the ranch house, where she had clean bandages, poultices, and shelter. The problem was distance and strength. The ranch house was nearly a mile away. The older boy couldn't walk, and she wasn't strong enough to carry him. The younger one was a dead weight. Her eyes fell on the vast, empty landscape, and the solution came to her as terrible as it was necessary. Dust devil. The thought was a physical blow. To give up her horse, her last connection to her past, her only means of escape from this desolate life. It was unthinkable. If she gave up the mare, she would be truly stranded, as isolated as a castaway on a desert island. If trouble came, real trouble like bandits or a rogue cavalry patrol, she would have no way to run. She would be trapped. She looked back at the boys. The older one had passed out from the pain, his head lolling to the side. The younger one's breathing was growing more shallow. They would die here. They would die here under the hammer of the sun. And their deaths would be on her conscience, a weight heavier than any solitude. She thought of her father, a man who valued a good horse above almost anything. But she also remembered him sharing his tobacco with a traveling Tohono O'odham man, the two of them sitting in silence, communicating through a shared respect for the harshness of the land. "There's different kinds of wealth, girl," he'd told her once. "And a clear conscience is worth more than a stable full of Arabians." Clara made her choice. It was a fool's bargain, trading her security, her freedom, for the lives of two boys who were supposed to be her enemies. She sprinted back to the ranch, her lungs burning. Dust Devil whinnied a soft greeting as Clara burst into the corral, her chest heaving. There was no time for a saddle. She grabbed the bridle, her hands trembling, as she slipped the bit into the mare's mouth. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, burying her face in the mare's soft, pale neck. "I'm so sorry." She led Dust Devil back to the creek bed at a fast trot. The boys were as she had left them, frighteningly still. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she managed to haul the younger boy onto the mare's back, draping him over her withers like a sack of flour. The older boy was more difficult. He was conscious again, his eyes sharp with a dawning understanding of her plan. He tried to help, pushing himself up with his arms, his face a mask of agony. It took their combined effort, a clumsy grunting affair, to get him seated behind his brother. He swayed, his body weak, but his hands instinctively gripped the mare's mane. He looked at her, his face etched with pain, exhaustion, and a profound questioning confusion. He didn't understand why she was doing this. Clara took Dust Devil's reins. She pointed a trembling finger towards the high peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains, a jagged silhouette against the eastern sky. "Go," she said, her voice cracking. "Your people, go." She gave the mare's flank a firm slap. "Go on, girl, go!" Dust Devil, ever obedient, hesitated for a moment, looking back at Clara with her intelligent eyes. Then she turned and began to walk, picking her way carefully through the rocky creek bed, carrying the two wounded boys away from the setting sun. Clara stood and watched until they were just a small, pale speck in the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. The sound of the mare's hooves faded, leaving behind an unbearable silence. She was alone, truly and completely alone. She had no horse, no protection, no way out. She had 40 acres of dust, a nearly dry well, and the clothes on her back. She had traded her last treasure for the lives of 2 strangers. As the first stars began to prick the deep indigo of the twilight sky, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if she hadn't saved them? What if she had only delayed their deaths, and in doing so signed her own death warrant? The Apache were not known for their sentimentality. What would happen if, or when, their people came looking for them? The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple before surrendering to the night. The temperature dropped quickly, as it always did in the desert. A cold wind began to whisper through the mesquite, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall here. For Clara, the encroaching darkness had never felt so menacing. Without Dust Devil's soft whinny from the corral, the silence of the ranch was absolute and unnerving. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every skittering sound of a lizard on the porch, every hoot of a distant owl was magnified, transformed into a potential threat. Her imagination, a beast she usually kept well leashed, broke free and ran wild. She barred the heavy wooden door and shuttered the 2 small windows, plunging the 1-room cabin into near total darkness. She lit a single tallow candle, its small flame casting huge dancing shadows that seemed to mock her solitude. The cabin, once a sanctuary built by her father's hands, now felt like a trap. She sat at the small, rough-hewn table, the Winchester resting across her lap. Her hands, stained with the boy's blood, trembled slightly. She had washed them in the basin, but she could still feel the phantom stickiness. She had done the right thing. She clung to that belief like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was the only thing keeping the terror at bay. But was the right thing the same as the smart thing? Out here they rarely were. To distract herself, she tried to eat. She gnawed on a piece of hardtack and some jerky, but the food tasted like ashes in her mouth. Her ears were strained, listening for the one sound she dreaded above all others, the sound of approaching horses. Not the slow, plodding walk of a cavalry patrol, but the fast, silent tread of unshod ponies. Hours crawled by. The moon rose, a cold silver disk in a sea of stars, casting the landscape outside in an eerie skeletal light. Clara found herself drifting into memories, her mind seeking refuge in the past. She remembered her father, Jedediah Arias, a man as tough and unyielding as the land he had chosen to tame. He had been a scout for the army before settling here, and he carried a complex understanding of the Apache. "They're not savages, Clara," he'd told her one evening as they watched the sunset. "They're fighting for their homes, same as we are. The difference is this has been their home for 1,000 years. We've only been here for 5. He had taught her to shoot, to track, to read the land. But he had also taught her that a person's worth wasn't determined by the color of their skin. It was a lesson that had cost him friendships among the other settlers who saw the world in simpler, harsher terms. She remembered her mother Ellen, whose hands could soothe a fevered brow or pull a calf from a struggling cow with equal skill. It was her mother's quiet faith that echoed in Clara's heart now. Kindness costs nothing, Ellen would say, but its value is immeasurable. Would her mother have thought her actions kind or simply suicidal? A floorboard creaked on the porch. Clara's blood ran cold. She froze her knuckles white on the stock of the Winchester. She lifted the rifle, pointing it squarely at the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The candle flame guttered, as if in response to her fear. Silence. She held her breath, listening. Was it a person? An animal? A coyote, perhaps drawn by the scent of the evening's meager meal? Or was it a warrior, silent as the night testing her defenses, minutes stretched into an eternity? Nothing. Just the wind moaning around the eaves of the cabin like a lost soul. She slowly lowered the rifle, her shoulders slumping with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. This was what the night would be, a series of small terrors, a battle fought entirely within her own mind. She must have dozed off, slumped in the chair, because she was jolted awake by a sound that was not a product of her imagination. It was the howl of a wolf. Close. And it was answered by another, and then another, until the night was filled with their mournful, hungry chorus. But beneath the howling she heard something else, a low, rhythmic chanting. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably human. Her fear returned, sharp and acidic. This was it. They had come. She scrambled to one of the shuttered windows and peered through a small crack in the wood. Under the stark moonlight she could see them. Figures on horseback, silhouetted on the ridge overlooking her property. Not one or two. Dozens. They were too far to make out details, but she could see the shape of them. The lances pointed toward the sky, the faint outline of feathers in their hair. They weren't attacking. They were watching. Waiting. Were they waiting for dawn to kill her? It was a known tactic, to let the terror build, to let the prey exhaust itself with fear before the final strike. A cold, grim certainty settled over her. She was going to die here. In this small cabin on this patch of dirt her father had poured his life into. She had gambled on kindness and lost. The irony was a bitter pill. Her final act, one of compassion, would be the cause of her death. She thought about making a run for it, trying to slip out the back and lose herself in the rocky terrain. But where would she go? On foot, she was no match for men on horseback. They would run her down for sport. No. If she was going to die, she would die here in her home. She would not die cowering. Clara walked back to the table, her steps steady. She checked the action on the Winchester, ensuring a round was chambered. She had 9 more in the magazine. 10 bullets. She would make them count. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. She didn't want to give them a target. She moved the table against the door to brace it and took up a position in the corner of the room, where she had a clear line of sight to both the door and the windows. And then she waited. She waited as the moon arced across the sky. She waited as the wolf calls faded and a new, deeper silence fell. She waited as the black of the night sky began to soften into the grey of pre-dawn. Through the crack in the shutter, she watched the eastern horizon. The waiting was the worst part. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the spirit. But with the fear came a strange sense of clarity. She had no regrets. She had saved those boys. Whatever happened now, she had honored the memory of her parents. She had been true to herself. As the first sliver of a blood-red sun crested the mountains, she heard it. The sound she had been dreading all night. The thunder of hoofbeats. Not a stealthy approach, but a full, earth-shaking charge. They were coming. Clara rested her cheek against the cool wood of the rifle stock, took a deep, steadying breath, and aimed at the center of the door. The sound was not a charge, as she had first thought. It was something more vast, more elemental. It was the sound of a living river of horses and men, a force of nature pouring down from the ridge and spreading across the valley floor. The ground itself seemed to tremble with their coming. Clara remained pressed into the corner, the rifle, a solid, heavy presence in her hands. Her world had shrunk to the narrow crack in the window shutter. Through it, she watched the spectacle unfold, a terrifying, mesmerizing pageant of power. There were not dozens. There were hundreds, 200 warriors at least. They fanned out in a wide crescent formation, their movements fluid and practiced like a flock of birds turning in unison. The rising sun glinted off rifle barrels and the sharp points of lances. Their faces glimpsed in the growing light were painted for war harsh lines of black and vermilion that obscured their humanity and turned them into avatars of vengeance. The air filled with the jingle of bridles, the creak of leather, and a low guttural murmur that was more felt than heard. They were Chiricahua Apache, the most feared of all the tribe's warriors born to the harshness of these mountains. They moved with a terrifying purpose, encircling her small cabin, cutting off all possibility of escape. They were a tidal wave of righteous fury, and her small homestead was a sand castle about to be washed away. Clara felt a profound, paralyzing awe. This was not a raid for cattle or supplies. This was a demonstration. This was an execution. Her plan to make a stand with her 10 bullets suddenly seemed pathetic, the fantasy of a frightened girl. 10 bullets against 200 warriors. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. A single rider detached himself from the main body and trotted forward. He rode a magnificent black stallion that seemed carved from the midnight sky. The horse was powerful, its neck arched its steps proud. But it was the man who commanded all attention. He was tall for an Apache, with broad shoulders and a presence that radiated absolute authority. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, revealing a physique honed by a life of hardship and war. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair, which flowed freely down his back. His face was stark and severe, a mask of granite, his eyes deep-set and shadowed. He looked not like a man, but like a spirit of the mountains, ancient and unforgiving. He rode to within 50 yards of the cabin and stopped his stallion, pawing at the dusty ground. Behind him, the 200 warriors sat motionless on their ponies, a silent, menacing jury. The world held its breath. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely dirge around the cabin. Clara's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. This had to be their leader, their father. He had come for his sons, or more likely for the woman who had failed to save them. Her act of mercy had been misinterpreted. They must have thought she'd captured them, or worse. Perhaps the boys had died on the journey, and Dust Devil had returned to her people, alone, a silent messenger of tragedy. The leader raised a hand, a clear, sharp gesture. The murmuring among the warriors ceased instantly. He then urged his stallion forward a few more paces, his dark eyes fixed on the small, silent cabin. He didn't shout. He didn't issue a challenge. He simply weighted his presence, a crushing weight, a silent accusation. Clara knew this was the moment of truth. She could stay hidden inside a cornered animal, waiting for the inevitable, or she could face her fate with the dignity her father had taught her. She chose the latter. Leaving the Winchester leaning against the wall, she took a deep breath. Her hands were slick with sweat. She walked to the door, her legs feeling like lead, and lifted the heavy bar. The wood scraped the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. She pulled the door open and stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the blinding light of the rising sun. She stood there, a lone woman, in a simple calico dress. Her blonde hair, usually tied back in a practical bun, had come loose and framed her face in wild tendrils. She was unarmed. She met the leader's gaze directly, her chin held high. She would not show them her fear. For a long moment, no one moved. It was a tableau frozen in time, the formidable war chief on his black stallion, the sea of silent warriors, and the solitary woman standing on the porch of her home, bathed in the red light of dawn. The chief's expression was unreadable. His face, a stoic mask. He surveyed her, his eyes taking in every detail from her disheveled hair to her bare hands. He looked at the cabin, the corral, the dry fields. His gaze was intense, searching. Clara's mind raced. What could she say? What could she do? There was no common language, no way to explain. All they could see was a white woman on a piece of land that had once been theirs, a woman who had been the last person to see two of their children. The chief spoke, his voice low and resonant, the Apache words rolling like thunder. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was not the furious shout she had expected. It was a question, a demand. He was waiting for her answer. Clara could only shake her head helplessly, her throat too dry to speak. She raised her empty hands, palms forward, in a universal gesture of peace, of having nothing to hide. It wasn't enough. A restless ripple went through the warriors behind him. One of them shouted something, his voice sharp and angry, and gestured toward the cabin with his lance. The leader silenced him with a glance. He then dismounted, his movements, fluid and graceful. He handed the reins of his stallion to a nearby warrior and began to walk toward her. Each step was deliberate, measured. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He was coming to kill her. She was sure of it. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer on her lips, her mother's face flashing in her mind's eye. He stopped at the foot of the 3 short steps leading to her porch. He was even more intimidating up close. He was close enough now that she could see the lines of care and grief etched around his eyes. This was not just a warlord. This was a father. He spoke again, slower this time, pointing first to his own chest, then gesturing out towards the mountains. He was asking about his sons. Clara's heart broke for him. She opened her mouth to try and form the words, to try and explain with gestures, when a movement behind the chief caught her eye. 2 figures were being brought forward from the back of the war party. One was leading a pale buckskin mare. Dust Devil. And walking beside the mare, limping but alive, was the older boy. The world which had been holding its breath seemed to exhale in a collective sigh. The tension that had been sharp enough to cut did not vanish, but it transformed into something else, a vast, uncertain curiosity. The 200 warriors were no longer a firing squad. They were an audience, watching the final act of a play, whose ending they did not know. The older boy, whose name Clara still didn't know, limped forward, leaning on the shoulder of another warrior. His leg was splintered and properly bandaged. He stopped beside the imposing chief, his father, and looked at Clara. The defiance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary respect. The younger boy was not with him, and a pang of fear shot through Clara had he not survived. The chief placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of profound relief and paternal love that transcended any cultural barrier. He then looked at Clara, and for the first time, his granite expression softened, revealing the father beneath the war chief. He spoke to his son in their native tongue, the words a soft, guttural flow. The boy listened, then turned his gaze to Clara. He took a hesitant step forward. "My brother, he is weak," the boy said, his English broken and heavily accented, but understandable. The healer says he will live. You did this. He gestured from his own bandaged leg to her. Relief washed over Clara so powerfully her knees felt weak. They were both alive. Her gamble had paid off. I am Nakai, the boy said, touching his chest. He then gestured to his father. This is my father Taza. The name hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. Taza. She knew that name. Every settler in the territory knew it. Taza was the eldest son of the legendary chief Cochise, the leader who had waged a brilliant and brutal decade-long war against the United States. Since Cochise's death the year before, the leadership of the Chiricahua had fallen to his sons. Taza was considered the more pragmatic one, the one who had agreed to settle his people on the reservation. To have him here on her porch was like having a figure from a myth walk into her life. Taza spoke again to Nakai, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Nakai translated. My father asks why. Why you help Apache boys, your people and my people. There is much bad blood. Clara looked from the boy to the chief, searching for the right words. How could she explain the complexities of her heart, the memory of her parents, the simple human ache she felt seeing children in pain? You were hurt, she said simply, looking at Nakai. Your brother, he's just a child. My mother taught me to help those who are suffering. It does not matter who they are. Nakai translated her words for his father. Taza listened intently, his dark eyes studying her face, searching for the truth in her words. The silence stretched thick and heavy. A warrior in the crowd shouted something, and several others grunted in agreement. Clara couldn't understand the words, but the angry, suspicious tone was clear. They did not believe her. They saw a trap, a trick. Taza turned his head slightly and uttered a single, sharp word. The descent was instantly silenced. He held the absolute respect of his men. He then turned back to Clara. He took a step closer, mounting the first step of her porch. He pointed to the bloody rags she had left in a pile near the door, evidence of her work from the night before. Then he pointed to the door of her cabin. Nakai spoke. He saw the signs of your care. He sees you are alone. He asks, were you not afraid? I was terrified. Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly with the memory of the long night. I thought you were coming to kill me. When Nakai translated this, a low murmur rippled through the warriors. They understood fear. It was a currency as common as bullets in this land. Her honesty, her admission of vulnerability, seemed to disarm them more than any show of bravado could have. Taza looked at her with a newfound respect. In his world, to admit fear and yet stand your ground was the definition of courage. He saw not a weak white woman, but a person of a different kind of strength. He took the final 2 steps up onto the porch so he was standing level with her. He was a head taller than her, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was a small, intricately carved turquoise stone, the color of a summer sky, tied to a thin leather thong. It was a talisman, an object of personal significance. He held it out to her in the palm of his hand. He says you have Diyi. Nakai translated, struggling for the word. A good spirit. A strong spirit. He thanks you for the lives of his sons. He says the Chiricahua do not forget a debt of honor. Clara hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the small stone. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt like static electricity passed between them. His skin was warm and rough. She looked up into his eyes and saw something that startled her, a flicker of personal curiosity, an interest that went beyond gratitude or a debt of honor. Taza then turned and issued a series of commands to his men. There was a flurry of activity. Several warriors dismounted. One of them came forward, leading Dust Devil, who whinnied softly when she saw Clara. Another warrior brought a string of 3 other horses, strong-looking ponies, and tied them to her corral fence. Another group began to unload supplies from their packs, blankets, dried meat, and sacks of corn. "What are they doing?" Clara asked, bewildered. "My father says you gave your only horse," Nakai explained. "He returns her and gives you more. He says your land is dry and you are alone. These are provisions, and 2 of his best warriors will remain camped on the ridge. They will watch over you, protect you." Clara was stunned into silence. She had expected death, and instead she was being given gifts protection. It was a turn of events so surreal she could barely comprehend it. Taza turned back to her one last time. He did not smile. His face was too stoic for such an easy expression, but the harsh lines around his eyes had softened. He gave her a slight, formal nod. Then he strode back to his black stallion, mounted in a single fluid motion, and with a shout led his war party away. They thundered past her cabin, a whirlwind of dust and sound, and receded back into the mountains from which they came, leaving behind only 2 silent sentinels on the ridge, the gift of horses, and a stunned woman standing on her porch with a piece of turquoise clutched in her hand. The days that followed were suspended in a strange new reality. The 2 Apache warriors on the ridge were silent, unobtrusive ghosts, a constant reminder of the debt owed and the protection now given. Their presence brought Clara a sense of security she hadn't felt in months, yet it also cemented her status as an outcast. Word of Taza's visit traveled on the wind, and the story grew more twisted with each telling. Neighbors who once might have offered a distant nod now hurried past her property, their faces masks of fear and suspicion. Clara's isolation, once a product of grief, was now a wall built of rumor. About a week later, Taza returned. He came not with a war party, but with only his son, Nakai, and 2 other warriors. He rode his black stallion into her yard with a quiet confidence, and Clara's heart beat a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Their initial conversations were a clumsy dance of language and gesture, with Nakai serving as a reluctant bridge between their 2 worlds. "My father asks if you are no longer afraid," Nakai translated one afternoon as they sat on the porch. "Tell him I am not," Clara answered, meeting Taza's steady gaze. "His men are honorable guards." Taza's visits became the new rhythm of her life. He would bring gifts, a freshly killed deer or a basket of wild berries. In return, Clara offered coffee, which he drank strong and black. They found ways to communicate beyond Nakai's translations. Taza would point to a hawk and say, "Its Apache name, Ij Aul." Clara would point to her well and say, "Water." He would repeat the English word, his pronunciation, careful a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Through these fragmented conversations, she began to see the man behind the formidable chief. He carried the immense weight of his people's future, trying to navigate a fragile peace that many, including his own warriors, did not trust. He spoke of his father Koshise with deep reverence, and of the sacredness of his mountain homeland. Clara, in turn, found herself speaking of her own family, her mother's garden, and her father's belief that this harsh land could be made to bloom. Taza listened with an unwavering intensity, and she felt not just heard, but profoundly understood. One evening, as twilight settled, he noticed her hands calloused and cut from her work. He gently took one of them, his thumb, tracing the rough lines on her palm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of deep respect for her strength and resilience. In that silent moment, something shifted between them, deepening from gratitude. into something far more dangerous and elemental. But their fragile world could not remain isolated. Silas Kane, a former Confederate major with a boundless appetite for land, had bought the neighboring ranch. He coveted Clara's property for its the only reliable water source for miles. Having failed to buy her out with threats, the rumors about her and the Apache gave him a new weapon. Kane rode into town, his voice booming in the saloons. He painted Clara as a traitor, an Indian lover, who was conspiring with savages. He played on the settlers' fears, stoking the embers of hatred into a dangerous flame. One afternoon, he and 2 of his hired guns rode to her ranch. "Hayes," Kane snarled, not bothering to dismount, "your game is over. I'm giving you one last chance. Sell me this place, or I can't be responsible for what good folks do to clean out a viper's nest." His eyes flickered toward the Apache sentinels on the ridge. Clara stood her ground. "This is my land, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice cold. "It is not for sale." Kane's face purpled with rage. "You'll regret this, girl," he spat before wheeling his horse around and galloping away. That evening, Taza found her troubled. She explained what had happened, and as he listened, his face grew dark, his jaw tightening. He understood men like Kane men who fed on fear and grew powerful on hatred. When she finished, he placed a hand on her arm, his touch firm and reassuring. "You are not alone, Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was both startling and comforting. He then spoke in Apache, his tone a low, dangerous rumble. Nakai translated his own voice, grim. "My father says this man, Kane, is a coyote who thinks he is a wolf. A storm is coming, and we will face it together." The storm broke 2 days later, not from the sky, but from the valley floor. Clara was woken, just before dawn, by a frantic whinny from the corral. It wasn't Dust Devil's familiar call, it was a sound of sheer terror. She grabbed the Winchester and rushed to the window, peering through the familiar crack in the shutter. The moon had set, and the world was cloaked in the deep, inky blackness that precedes the sunrise. At first she saw nothing, then a flicker of orange caught her eye. At the far end of her property, near the dilapidated barn, a fire had started. As she watched, another flicker appeared, and then another. Silas Kane wasn't planning a direct assault. He was trying to burn her out, to smoke her from her hole like a rabbit. The dry grass and brittle wood of the fences would go up like tinder. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and sharp, but then her father's training took over. Don't panic. Assess. Act. She knew the 2 Apache sentinels on the ridge would have seen the fires. But would they get to her in time? Kane and his men, she counted at least a dozen riders. Dark shapes moving against the growing flames were between her and the ridge. She had to slow them down. Barring the front door, she ran to the back of the cabin, where a smaller, less used exit led out toward the well and the rocky hillside. She slipped out into the cold night air, the smell of smoke already thick and acrid. The Winchester felt like a part of her arm. She didn't run towards the open ground. Instead, she scrambled up the small rocky outcrop behind her cabin, the place where her parents' graves lay. From here she had a clear view of the approaching riders, who were now moving with more confidence, believing her to be trapped in the cabin. The fire cast them in a demonic, flickering light. "All right, Jedediah," she whispered to her father's grave marker, her breath pluming in the cold air. "Let's see if I remember what you taught me." She rested the rifle barrel on a steady rock, took a deep breath, aimed not at a man, but at the horse of the lead rider, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester shattered the night. The lead horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider. The other men yelled in surprise and anger, reining in their horses and searching the darkness for the source of the shot. They had expected a cornered, terrified woman, not a determined sniper. "She's up in the rocks!" Kane bellowed his voice, carrying clearly in the night air. "Spread out, flush her out!" Clara worked the lever action, chambering another round. She fired again this time, aiming for the ground, in front of another rider, sending up a spray of dirt and rock. Her goal wasn't to kill, not yet. It was to disorient, to delay, to buy time. But they were too many. They began to dismount, using their horses for cover, and started advancing on foot, their own rifles beginning to spit fire into the rocks around her. Chips of stone stung her cheek. The fight was turning against her. She was pinned down. Just as a wave of despair began to wash over her, she heard it. It was a sound that started as a low, chilling tremor and grew into a terrifying ululation that echoed off the mountains. A war cry, the cry of the Chiricahua. From the ridge, Taza and his warriors descended, not like a river, but like an avalanche. They didn't come from one direction. They seemed to materialize from the darkness on all sides, a silent, deadly force that had used the chaos of the fire to encircle Kane's men completely. The two sentinels had done their job. They had warned Taza, who had clearly been expecting trouble, and had kept his main force nearby. The tables turned in an instant. Kane's men, who had been the confident hunters, were now the terrified prey. The disciplined fire of the Apache warriors was devastating. They moved with a lethal grace, using the terrain for cover their shots, finding their marks with grim precision. Clara saw Taza on his black stallion, appearing like a spectre out of the smoke. He wasn't leading from the rear. He was in the thick of it, a rifle in one hand, a war club in the other. He moved with a focused, deadly intensity that was terrifying and magnificent to behold. The battle was short and brutal. Kane's hired guns were no match for the Apache warriors on their own turf. Several went down, and the rest broke and ran scrambling for their horses in a desperate, disorganized retreat. Silas Kane, however, was consumed by a mad fury. He saw Clara silhouetted by the fire against the rocks, and his hatred overwhelmed his survival instinct. "This is your fault, you witch!" he screamed, raising his pistol and charging toward her position. Taza saw him. With a powerful kick, he spurred his stallion to intercept. The black horse surged forward, cutting off Kane's path, but Kane was wild, firing his pistol erratically. One of his shots went wide, but another caught Taza high in the shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. Taza grunted in pain but did not fall. Ignoring his wound, he threw his war club with devastating accuracy. The heavy wood struck Kane squarely in the chest, knocking him from his feet. Before Kane could recover, two Apache warriors were on him, disarming him and hauling him up. The fighting was over. The fires were already beginning to die down. The sun was rising, its gentle light revealing the grim aftermath of the night's violence. Clara scrambled down from the rocks and ran to Taza. His warriors parted to let her through. He was slumped forward, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt. "Get him inside," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. They helped him into the cabin and laid him on her simple bed. His warriors stood uncertainly at the door, their faces grim. Clara ignored them. She was no longer a rancher's daughter. She was a healer, her mother's legacy come to life. With Nakai translating her urgent requests, she sent them for clean water and rags. She cut away the shirt. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was painful and bleeding heavily, but it had missed the bone. As she worked, cleaning the wound with a skill and tenderness that belied the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, Taza watched her, his eyes dark with pain, but also with an intensity that burned. When she had bandaged the wound as best she could, she looked up and found him still watching her. The cabin was silent. Outside, the sun was fully up, flooding the valley with clean, new light. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was the only word he spoke, but in it she heard everything. Gratitude, respect, and something more, something that had been forged in the crucible of that night. She took his hand. It was not the tentative questioning touch of their first meetings. It was a firm, steady grip. An anchor. They were from two different worlds, a chasm of culture, language, and history separating them. But in that small, smoke-scented cabin surrounded by the aftermath of violence, they had found their common ground. It wasn't built on land or language, but on shared courage, mutual respect, and a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. The future was a vast, uncharted territory, as uncertain as the peace Tarza was trying to build for his people. There would be more men like Cain. There would be judgment and prejudice from her world, and suspicion from his. But standing there, holding the hand of the Chiricahua chief who had ridden through fire to save her, Clara Hayes knew she was no longer alone. Together they would build a bridge across that chasm, one difficult, courageous day at a time. And so, on the ashes of hatred, a new story began. The tale of Clara Hayes and the Apache chief Tarza is more than just a story of the Wild West. It's a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. It shows that compassion is a language that transcends all barriers, and that love can be a bridge between two worlds thought to be forever at war. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the harshest of lands and the darkest of times, the bravest thing you can ever be is kind. If this story of unlikely love and incredible courage moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more tales from the untamed West to share with you, stories of forgotten heroes, incredible survival, and the enduring spirit that forged a nation. Thank you for listening.